All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we are exploring a really profound conceptual leap. We're looking at a framework that treats the human brain not as some passive receiver of reality, but as an active, high-powered collision engine. We are literally going to challenge the very foundations of how we think about meaning, memory, and the entire architecture of our minds.
It's a massive question, right? To understand how we might actually terraform the course of our planet, we first have to ask if we can fundamentally rewrite the building codes of human consciousness itself. I mean, is recursive vector interference the one massive change to neurosemiotics over neuroscience that could serve as this global trim tab? Well, let's find out.
Here is our cognitive roadmap for today. We'll move from terraforming the human field to the Rebus baseline model of neuroscience, explore the new RVI paradigm, break down aesthetic binding, dive into neurosemiotics, and finally look at how all of this acts as a global trim tab.
Okay, Section 1. Terraforming the human field. Renovating the psyche's building codes. Now, when we say terraforming, we aren't talking about physical planetary engineering with bulldozers or anything. We're talking about renovating the mind to survive modern surveillance and spectacle. This process acts as a sort of tactical jailbreak from our current institutional enclosures. The sources describe it as training our attention to survive the weather, and by weather they mean the constant, heavy barrage of branding, addiction, and panic we face every single day. The goal? To replace all that passive receiving with true cognitive sovereignty.
Moving on to Section 2, the neuroscience of Rebus, the prior baseline model.
To really grasp this paradigm shift, we first need to understand the dominant scientific baseline, which is known as the Rebus model. Rebus stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. It essentially argues that to find relief, the brain must loosen its beliefs, dissolve the ego, and basically melt into the background. Think of it like a biological solvent that flattens the brain's hierarchy, so bottom-up errors can just reorganize things peacefully.
Under this baseline model, your brain is, well, just a prediction engine. It's viewed as a biological machine constantly trying to manage entropy, reduce errors in its environment, and minimize surprise at all costs. It just wants to relax the system to find peace.
Now for Section 3, the RVI paradigm shift from relaxation to collision.
So look at this stark contrast. While the old REBS model wants to relax and flatten your beliefs into a passive state, the new RVI model actively collides them. In RVI, the operator, you, doesn't just dissolve away. You stay right at the console, generating a signal and forcing a highly dense interference zone.
The absolute crucial takeaway here is that recursive vector interference views consciousness as the product of intentional collision, not passive relaxation. It's what happens when two totally asynchronous waves of meaning, say your strictly logical reasoning and your deep emotional narrative, actually crash into each other. They don't cancel out. They sum together to build a completely new, stable pattern. It creates a structural ridge that your mind can actually stand on.
And there's rigorous mathematical physics backing this up. RVI shows that when two cognitive streams meet with perfect timing, kind of like two ripples in a pond merging into one massive wave, they sum constructively. Now, if they're completely out of sync, they just burn energy as static or noise. But when perfectly timed, they build a stable pattern the nervous system reuses. It treats the brain almost like a massive city of clocks, heavily reliant on the precise timing of these signals.
This source material, bluntly, and I mean bluntly, puts it like this. Your brain isn't just trying to avoid being surprised. It is an active collision engine. It is literally hammering meaning into coherence through impact. You aren't just passively receiving reality, you are forging it by intentionally smashing different cognitive streams together.
Which leads us to Section 4. Mechanics of Aesthetic Binding. Engineering the collision.
So how does this collision actually spit out meaning? That brings us to aesthetic binding. This is the critical and frankly often incredibly uncomfortable moment where all that chaotic interference finally stabilizes. It's the exact moment a new reality locks in, one that you feel pre-verbally. It's that sudden sense of coherence or rightness before you even have the words to explain it.
To actually use RVI in practice, you deliberately introduce a disruptive new wave, maybe a completely new narrative or a totally unfamiliar environment. Then, you observe the clash between this new wave and your old embedded habits. And yeah, it might feel like panic or anger or profound relief. Finally, you take that resulting pattern and feed it back into your brain recursively.
You iterate that collision over and over until the interference stops being noise and starts becoming actual load-bearing structure.
Because these overlapping cortical loops, like the linear reasoning happening in your prefrontal cortex and the grand mythic narratives running in your default mode network, they don't just cooperate peacefully, they violently interfere. And it's through that dense interference that complex ideas are compressed into a profound symbolic resonance.
Section 5. Neurosemiotics over pure biology. The operator at the console.
This is where we hit a fundamental philosophical shift. We have to completely rethink the hardware of the brain. Under this neurosemiotic framework, the brain isn't just a bunch of electricity moving down biological wires. The sources propose it acts as a wave-based photonic medium. Biophotons are literally traveling along myelinated axons that behave exactly like fiber optic tubes. So meaning is actively created by colliding symbols in this incredibly high-speed optical regime.
I absolutely love this poetic summary from the sources. It highlights that the static, the constant contradiction, or the noise we feel in our minds, it's actually a deeply meaningful signal. Your brain isn't failing when it hits a contradiction. It has just entered a mythogenic orbit, circling the problem to synthesize a totally new, higher-level truth.
Think of it like a skipped frame in a movie theater. When the time-based correction shifts and a mental clock slips just a tiny bit, memory and perception suddenly become visible. The medium stops correcting itself fast enough to hide its own construction, which gives the operator, meaning you, a brief window to see the narrative architecture and actively rewrite it.
Finally, Section 6. Trim Tabbing the Earth. The tiny rudder of consciousness.
Let's zoom way out to the big picture. Why does mastering this microscopic neurological shift matter? Because it acts as a trim tab for global systemic change. A trim tab is that tiny rudder on a ship that turns the big rudder, which then turns the entire massive ship. If meaning is engineered through intentional collision, then RVI is the exact change to neurosemiotics that can trim tab the Earth. By rewriting our own internal interference patterns, we can actively break inherited trauma loops, shatter coercive programming, and establish true cognitive sovereignty. Under RVI, you do not dissolve into the background. You don't surrender your agency to some flattened biological landscape. You stay fully engaged. You force the interference. You hold the contradiction tightly until your very interface with reality upgrades itself. The operator stays, but the console changes.
So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a heavy question to consider. What inherited, outdated loops are currently running on repeat in your own mind right now? And more importantly, what intentional, completely out-of-sync wave are you going to introduce today to force a collision and build a new, load-bearing ridge for your future? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.